I've got a pop culture example. I've got two pop culture examples of egoism. Although you can find many. Let's do Gordon Gekko. Y'all seen the original Wall Street movie? There was a more recent one, but in the first one, Michael Douglas plays basically a venture capitalist, and he gives this speech at a board meeting where they got to vote on what to do with the company. If we can get it to pull up here.
To the stockholder. The Carnegies, the Mellons, the men that built this great industrial empire made sure of it.
Go back.
I appreciate the opportunity you're giving me, Mr. Cromwell, as the single largest shareholder in Tell Our Paper to speak. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're not here to indulge in fantasy, but in political and economic reality. America has become a second-rate power. Its trade deficit and its fiscal deficit are at nightmare proportions. Now, in the days of the free market, when our country was a top industrial power, there was accountability to the stockholder. The Carnegies, the Mellons, the men that built this great industrial empire made sure of it because it was their money at stake. Today, management has no stake in the company. Altogether, these men sitting up here own less than 3% of the company. And where does Mr. Cromwell put his $1 million to hold? Not in Teldar stock, he owns less than 1%. You own the company. That's right. You, the stockholder. And you are all being royally screwed over by these bureaucrats with their steak lunches, their hunting and fishing trips, their corporate jets and golden parachutes.
This is an outrage! Get out of line, Kiko!
Teldar Paper, Mr. Cromwell, Teldar Paper has 33 different vice presidents, each earning over $200,000 a year. Now, I have spent the last 2 months analyzing what all these guys do, and I still can't figure it out. One thing I do know is that our paper company lost $110 million last year, and I'll bet that half of that was spent in all the paperwork going back and forth between all these vice presidents. The new law of evolution in corporate America seems to be survival of the unfittest. Well, in my book, you either do it right or you get eliminated. In the last 7 deals I've been involved with, there were 2.5 million stockholders who have made a pre-tax profit of $12 billion. Thank you. I am not a destroyer of companies. I am a liberator of them. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar Paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
So there's Gordon Gekko's endorsement of greed. And then if you've seen Rick and Morty much at all, you know Rick is pretty much motivated by self-interest and self-interest alone, right? So he's our other pretty good example that you read about for today. So let's go through a little bit of this. Hobbes, who we're going to encounter again, proposed a contract theory of morality. Sometimes he's also treated, but he also espoused psychological egoism. So here's what he says about on that front. So he says, well, I'll do more of this later, but with the contract stuff. But Hobbes thinks that the state of nature is basically chaotic and violent, but you're self-interested. And so the reason to move out of the state of nature where everything's chaotic is out of your own self-interest to make agreement with others. So that's the kind of self-interested element of it. So he says, no man giveth, but with intention of good to himself, because gift is voluntary, and of all voluntary acts, the object is to every man of his own good, of which if men see, they shall be frustrated. There will be no beginning of benevolence or trust, nor consequently of mutual help. So even though the motive is self-interest, we get those other aspects of morality like mutual help out of that. Benevolence as well. So here's a kind of argument that might go along with that. Mr. Lincoln once remarked to a fellow passenger on an old-time mud coach that all men were prompted by selfishness in doing good. His fellow passenger was antagonizing his position when they were passing over a corduroy bridge that spanned a slough. As they crossed this bridge, they spied an old razorback sow in the bank making a terrible noise because her pigs had got into the slough and were in danger of drowning. As the old coach began to climb the hill, Mr. Lincoln called out, "Driver, can you stop just a moment?" Then Lincoln jumped out, ran back, and lifted the little pigs out of the mud and water and placed them back on the mother's back. When he returned, his companion remarked, "Now, Abe, where does selfishness come into this little episode?" "Why, bless your soul, Ed, this was the very essence of selfishness. I should have no peace of mind all day had I gone on and left the suffering old sow worrying over those pigs. I did it to get peace of mind, don't you see?" So he did this good thing for others, but out of what? Self-interest, right? So here's one way of understanding that basic principle of psychological egoism. So since everyone is an egoist because everyone always tries to do what will bring him or her satisfaction. So self-interest or self-satisfaction is the goal, right? What does that exactly mean? It could mean that for any act A, everyone does A in order to obtain satisfaction. In other words, we all want to be happy. So to satisfy that, we always act conscientiously to bring about that end. But then you might ask the question, well, what about masochists and drug addicts? They seem to be acting contrary to their self-interest, right? So you have to worry about that little problem. Masochists like pain being inflicted upon them, and drug addicts are doing something that destroys their health, so that doesn't look like it's in self-interest. So do those examples show that people aren't always acting on their rational self-interest or aren't always motivated by that? Key thing there. It could mean, here's another option, here are two more options. We all do the act that we most want to do, and this, as a consequence, we're satisfied by the success of carrying out that act or performing the act. But there's an issue there as well. We don't always do what we would most want to do. For example, I'm not at the beach right now. I'm at work. So similarly, addicts don't seem to, so if I'm doing something that I don't, so if my self-interest is doing what I most want to do right now, then I'm not acting in it, right? I'd really rather be at home playing a video game, right? So that seems like, again, the addiction and having, performing actions that are not what we most want to do seem to run counter to that principle. Here's the third option. We always try to do what we most want to do, and as a consequence of success in carrying out the act, we get experienced satisfaction. But that's fallacious as well. It confuses the motive with the experience. And of course, just because you have a motive to get a certain kind of experience is no guarantee that you'll end up with that experience. So we end up with an issue there as well. So what we're developing here then is we've got an argument, but we need to figure out what exactly we mean in a couple of scenarios here. So let me get the argument out first. So call this the argument from psychological egoism. And it's got to mean, one of those three things. So we can write the argument out like this. There's one. If, I'm going to abbreviate, psychological egoism is true, then ethical egoism is the correct moral theory. Two, we've just seen people arguing that at least some version of psychological egoism is true. That would give me, thus, ethical egoism is correct. So notice it's going from psychological egoism to ethical egoism. So let's call that the argument from psychological egoism for ethical egoism. Remember the distinction now? One of them is descriptive theory, one of them is the prescriptive theory. So there's one argument for psychological egoism. Let's take a look at another argument. This one comes from Ayn Rand. So Rand was a popular writer and a public figure. She wrote novels, but they were like kind of philosophical novels. She also wrote philosophy, like straight prose that was nonfiction. So the virtue of selfishness, that's what the title of her article. Sometimes it's published under the title of Objectivist Ethics, but the basic idea is the virtue of selfishness, right? The good part of selfishness. So she's advocating for ethical egoism, but she's not going to appeal to psychological egoism. So her argument's going to be different, even though her conclusion's the same. So she says, any action taken for the benefit of others is good, and any action taken for one's own benefit is evil. That's how people normally construe things, right? Thus, the beneficiary of an action is the only criterion of moral value, and so long as the beneficiary is anybody other than oneself, anything goes. So in other words, radical altruism is what morality is comprised of. You have to always be acting for the benefit of others, and so long as you're not acting selfishly for your own benefit, then you're acting permissibly, if not obligatory. So she's drawing this distinction. We've got the ethics of altruism and then ethical egoism. So if man accepts the ethics of altruism, his first concern is not how to live his life, but how to sacrifice it. Notice she goes right from living your life to now it's not even being neutral, you got to sacrifice it. It's kind of strong slip, right, to a pretty robust claim there. Altruism erodes men's capacity to grasp the value of an individual life. It reveals a mind from which the reality of a human being is wiped out. Altruism holds death as its ultimate goal and standard of value. And it is logical that renunciation, resignation, self-denial, and every other form of suffering, including self-destruction, are the virtue of its advocates. So you've got to sacrifice yourself to others, is what she claims the ethics of altruism requires. So then she says, by elevating the issues of helping others to the central and primary issue of ethics, altruism has destroyed the concept of any authentic benevolence or goodwill among men. It has indoctrinated men with the idea that to value another human being is to act selflessly, or as an act of selflessness, thus implying that man can have no personal interest in others. that do value another means to sacrifice oneself, that any love, respect, or admiration a man may feel for others is not and cannot be the source of his own enjoyment. It's evil, right, because you liked it for yourself. But this is a threat to his existence, a sacrificial blank check signed over to his loved ones. So she says, man is not a sacrificial animal to help others, and that's not his moral duty. Concern for the welfare of those who one loves, is a rational part of one's own selfish interest. So basically concern for like your loved ones, right, would be within your own self-interest. Thus, your highest moral purpose is the achievement of your own happiness. Your own money is yours. Use it to save your wife. That is your moral right and your rational moral choice. So in other words, if you're helping others, in order for it to be correct on this view, ultimately it has to be because it gave you the benefit that you wanted, even if it helped them. Right? So it's true that what I mean by selfishness is not what is meant conventionally or in popular opinion. This is one of the worst indictments of altruism. It means that altruism permits no concept of the self-respecting, self-supporting man who supports his own life by his own effect and neither sacrifices himself for others. This means that altruism permits no view of men except as sacrificial animals and profiteers on sacrifice, as victims and parasites. That it permits no concept of a benevolent coexistence among men, that it permits no conception of justice then, basic moral category, right? Each of these theories is going to is basically a theory of justice. So according to this view, what's just is getting what's in our self-interest, right? Our rational self-interest. We could be mistaken about that and stuff like that. So she's not saying just because I say it's in my self-interest, it must be. I could be wrong about it. But what's genuinely in my rational, enlightened self-interest, I'm obligated to do. So it's the pursuit of one's own happiness then. So the actor must always be the beneficiary of his action. And a man must act for his own rational self-interest. But his right to do so is derived from his nature as man and from the function of moral values in human life, and therefore is applicable only in the context of rationality, objectively demonstrated and validated moral principles which define and determine his actual self-interest. So she's not making some caricature here. We shouldn't straw man Rand and say, oh, she says just do whatever you want and that's moral. That's not what she's saying. It is not licensed to do as one pleases and is not applicable to the altruist image of the selfish brute, nor to any man motivated by irrational emotions, feelings, urges, or wishes or whims, which we certainly are on occasion. So the rational man does not forget that his life is the source of all values, and as such, a common bond among living beings and against inanimate matter, that other men are potentially able to achieve the same virtues as his own and thus be of enormous value to him. This does not mean that he regards human lives as interchangeable with his own. He recognizes the fact that his own life is the source not only of his values, but of his capacity to value. If you were dead, you couldn't have any valuations at all. It's certainly true. Therefore, the value he grants to others is a secondary consequence or an extension, a secondary projection of the primary value, which is himself. So because y'all are similar to me, I have to recognize y'all as also being self-interested agents, right? So here's a big issue that will pop up with Rand. And a lot of academic philosophers don't think very highly of Rand. Here's kind of an example of why. It has to do with kind of the quality of some of her arguments, as we'll learn here. So let me do this one first. But I don't think I really explained much about the is-ought problem to y'all, so I'll do it now. It's a meta-ethical problem. Is descriptive. Ought evaluative. or prescriptive, normative. This tells us the way the world is. That's what science does, right? It tells us the way the world is, the way things are. This is the way they ought to be. And the is-ought problem is that a purely factual claim, or I should, hang on, purely factual. The issue is that an ought can't be derived from a purely factual claim. Hume, who articulates this basic problem, says because of that morality is rooted in sentiments, not facts or rational insight or rational truths. It takes your emotions to motivate you. So he said, famously said, the reason is a slave to the passions. Reason is only instrumental, according to him. So he says, look, basic thing here. If the building is on fire, that doesn't imply that you ought to run out. In order to imply that you ought to run out, you have to inject a desire, namely your desire to live. If you didn't have that desire, you might stick around, right? So his point is that pure facts, pure reason, doesn't give us normative claims, prescriptive claims. So the idea here is that you can't derive an ought from an is. Again, can't bridge that gap. Here's Rand's attempt to respond to that. And it's really a non-response. She doesn't advance a new reason, she just repeats her claim in the face of the criticism. So that's not a good move. Generally, you got to advance a new reason. So she says, in answer to those philosophers who claim that no relation can be established between ultimate ends or values and the facts of reality, let me stress that the fact of a living entity's exist and function necessitates the existence of values and of an ultimate value which is given to his own life. But that clearly doesn't follow, because I could exist and say my life is meaningless, everybody else's life means more. So it doesn't necessarily, the fact that I exist doesn't automatically lead to egoism. So thus the validation of value judgments is to be achieved by reference to the facts of reality. The fact that a living entity is determines what it ought to do. So much for the issue of the relationship between ought and is. But of course, just because you're alive doesn't tell you to do what you want versus do what somebody else wants. So again, that's kind of a pretty good example of why Rand isn't lauded too much among, even libertarian academic philosophers kind of don't like Rand because of this kind of stuff. So we can get the following kind of argument from Rand. I kind of don't like that way of formulating, so I'm going to do a bit of a different here. I think it's more helpful for y'all if we start with a dichotomy. And notice how she formulates it, so I'll just do it this way. So either we got ethical egoism, and self-interest, rational self-interest is the criteria of right and wrong, versus altruism. How did she characterize altruism, though? It was an ethics of sacrifice, right? So, can I be altruistic without sacrificing myself? Yeah, you see the problem already, right? What does that start to look like if we do it? It's either all pure self-interest, or it's either all pure altruism. If I had a premise like that, what fallacy might you start worrying about? False choice, right? because it looks like we have many, it looks like I don't have to choose. How many of us in here as individuals have an interest in having clean drinking water? So that looks like a common interest, not just my self-interest, right? So it looks like we don't have to choose between either pure egoism, pure self-interest, and pure altruism, right? That's part of the problem to worry about. So think about that when you go through the reading for Thursday. He's going to mention that kind of thing. Then, right? All right, questions about what we covered today, either the argument from psychological egoism or Rand's argument. Everybody good? Pretty straightforward. All right, folks, be sure and read the Rachel's and bring a copy of it for next time. Actually, we're pretty early. Let's do one thing. Grab a sheet of paper. Let's do a thought experiment. Let me find it, though. Here we go. Let's get you thinking critically a little bit before we leave about egoism. So this is Feinberg, and he offers a criticism of psychological egoism with this thought experiment. So I'm going to read the thought experiment, and I'm going to have you think about it for a little bit, and then write up a paragraph response about what you think about it. All right? So imagine a person, Jones, who is first of all devoid of intellectual curiosity. He has no desire to acquire any knowledge for its own sake, and thus is utterly indifferent to questions of science, mathematics, and philosophy. Imagine further that the beauties of nature leave Jones cold. He is unimpressed by the autumn foliage. What's autumn? I'm unfamiliar with that concept after living here for 20 years. I just know green and not so green. So the snow-capped mountains and the rolling oceans, long walks in the country and skiing forays in the winter are to him equally a bore. Moreover, let us suppose that Jones can find no appeal in art. Novels are dull, poetry a pain, paintings nonsense, and music just noise. Suppose further that Jones has neither the participants nor the spectators' passion for baseball, football, tennis, or any other sport. Swimming to him is a cruel aquatic form of calisthenics, the sun only a cause of sunburn, dancing is coeducational idiocy, conversation a waste of time, the other sex an unappealing mystery, politics is a fraud, religion mere superstition, and the misery of millions of underprivileged human beings is nothing to be concerned with or excited about. Suppose finally that Jones has no talent for any kind of handicraft, industry, or commerce, and that he does not regret that fact. What then is Jones interested in? He must desire something. To be sure, he does. Jones has an overwhelming passion for and complete preoccupation with his own happiness. So that's the only thing he's interested in, but he's not interested in anything else. Right? Make sense? So here's the question. I want you to give me at least a paragraph, and you need to give me a straight, clear answer one way or another, and then you need to try and support your reason, your answer with a reason. Give me about a paragraph explanation, all right? So will Jones be able to satisfy his desire to be happy if he only has a desire for his own happiness and no other desires? Question makes sense? Think about it for a minute. Give me about a paragraph or so response to that.